Welcome back, everyone. So for this session, we're going to go to Latin America in the 60s and 70s, and specifically we're going to look at Brazilian and Argentinian artists who were really important for this history of socially engaged and participatory art that we're tracing. There's a lot of really wonderful work. I might have a little too many examples. I got a little too excited. So I might have to move a bit more quickly than I normally do, but I hope when we get together during our meeting that some of these works will come back up in our conversations because they give us a lot of food for thought. So there are a lot of great, wonderful works. So without further ado, in Bishop's chapter, she doesn't really talk about Brazilian artists. They're more well known than their Argentinian counterparts from this period. So she wants to focus more on Argentina, rightly so. So there's a lot to say there, but I did want to give you an introduction to the Brazilian context because, again, they're just really wonderful, important works that we can talk about and we look at. So in this lecture, I'm going to try to fill out the Brazilian side a little bit more for you so that you can see both in context. So as Bishop says in the beginning of this chapter, she makes a distinction which I think by and large does hold true, although I think it might be a little too much of a generalization, and this might be a little more porous than we think. But generally speaking, I think it's true that Brazilian artists of this period are more tactile, haptic, like interested in touch, sensuous, like they're really interested in the body, within social space, and within creativity and communication and politics. Whereas Argentinian artists, even when they're working with the public, even when it's participatory and the human body is involved, and you'll see sometimes non-human bodies are involved. I have at least one example of that today. For Brazilian artists. There's something more cerebral and maybe even a little more antagonistic about Argentinian artists, like almost something more hostile and foreboding about their work. So I'll be interested to hear what you think about the distinction between the Brazilian context and the Argentinian context once you've seen all these examples I give you today. But what binds them together is the history of Latin American politics in the 20th century, and especially the increasingly repressive military regimes that really pop up all over the place in the post-colonial context of Latin America. And two of the most well-known, Chile would be a big one, but Brazil and Argentina in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and even afterwards. You have a political situation that's repressive, that's hostile to democratic freedom. In some cases, actual elections are overturned. The democratic will of the people are overturned through juntas, through depositions, through military regimes, and sometimes. Actually, a number of times, the United States and the CIA secretly, we now know, secretly helped with these coups, helped with these juntas, because the military regimes would be more favorable for international trade and multinational corporations and so on and so forth. So this is a very dark history, one that's still with us in a neo-colonial context. And the book to read for this, to really get you started to understand this history, is The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. It's a classic. It's a must-read. It's very, very good. She doesn't only talk about the Latin American context. She also talks about Katrina, and she talks about other places. But she gives you a really good history. So all that is to say that all of the artists that we talk about today and all the works that we talk about are going to be in some ways engaged with the political situation of their time, where their country has become hostile and repressive. And in some cases, we're not just talking about censoring art, but we're talking about disappearing people. We're talking about actual violence and actual killings, and really being living under threat. So this is a rich, dark history of Latin American politics of the last century. So there's a lot more to be said, but you're just, now you sort of understand, if you didn't know this already, the political backdrop to these works, and read about it, because it's a fascinating and harrowing history. So we start in Brazil, and one of the most famous and important artists would be Helio Oiticica. And he's done a number of works, and he's one of those. Now in the histories of participatory art, he's one of the most prominent figures, along with Lygia Clark, who we're going to talk about in a moment. But he was influenced by the favelas, by poor working class people living in Brazil in these favelas. Favelas would be like the poorest part of town. Sometimes favelas are built in the outskirts of town, in trash heaps and this sort of thing. So really the most modest forms of living. And so Helio Oiticica was trained as an artist. He was part of the concretism movement and then the neo-concrete movement in Brazil. But then he started to gravitate towards, he wanted to leave the stodgy sort of elite environment of the art world in Buenos Aires, and he went to the favelas of Rio de Janeiro and started engaging with people who lived there and learning from them. And he saw that they would dance. He saw these samba dances, and I've just read that he actually became a very proficient samba dancer. And this dance would involve dress. It would involve like wearing colorful dress and so on and so forth. And so Oiticica started devising these works. He would make these parangoles. But parangoles, and there are lots of different ones. There would be different fabrics, different textiles. Sometimes they would be filled with various materials that people could wear and dance and be engaged with his work. So these are not objects to be shown in a museum, although they have been, and now, of course. But they were meant to be worn and used and shared with the public. And he even had a show at MoMA a few years after this, where he invited people from Brazil to come and wear parangolas and go to MoMA and sort of dance as part of his show. And what's sad, but I guess poignant and maybe not that surprising, is that MoMA didn't allow these people in back then, which is quite crazy, right? It's quite incredible. So there's a class politics at work here. There's an engagement and activation of the viewer, and this sort of joyful dancing. When we talk about Brazilian art during this context, we can't forget that this is the moment of the Tropicalia movement. If you don't know what Tropicalia is, go to iTunes or wherever it is, or YouTube or whatever, and Google Tropicalia music, and there's just wonderful movements of Tropicalia music at this time. Music that was directly flying in the face of the repressive military dictatorship in Brazil. And like websites like Pitchfork, they review lots of music. They've had all sorts of reissues and discussions about Tropicalia music. It's a lot of fun to listen to. Very important in the history of music. Well, Oiticica is part of this, right? So there's this way in which Oiticica's participatory works are more joyful. They're about dancing, and they're about being engaged. And some of the parangolas will even have slogans and writings on it, usually political or social, right? Having to do, again, with this political backdrop that we're talking about. And speaking of the Tropicalia movement, it actually comes from Oiticica himself. This is an installation that he did, so you could imagine people wearing parangolas and going in and becoming, like having basically like becoming engaged with each other and having a social situation, having a nice time. I can imagine like people drinking caporeiras or something as part of this installation, which was called Tropicalia. This is really important because later on, in the 90s and forward, this type of work, where the artist is basically setting up a space where people can be socially engaged, can have conversations, and in this case, I mean, it seems like you would want to party. It looks like, like It has all these sort of cliches about Brazil and the tropicalness of Brazil and the beaches and that sort of thing, right? He's taking that into the institution. I remember seeing this actually. I don't know if anybody out there saw the Oiticica retrospective at the new museum. This was now like 5 years ago or something like that. They recreated this, and it was nice to walk through, along with a number of his other works. So Oiticica is really important for the history of participatory work. One that is obviously socially engaged and political. It's coming out of this context of the military regime and dictatorship in Brazil, but it's also joyous. It's almost like one of those revolutionary acts based in love and in joyfulness. The other really important artist, equally important, who I find fascinating is Lygia Clark. So she was also Brazilian. And like Oiticica, she's forced to leave. They're going to end up going to other places in the world, New York, but also London. And Lygia Clark ends up in Paris for quite some time, and she teaches at the Sorbonne. So like Oiticica, she comes out of the neo-concrete movement. And in the early 60s, she starts to make these sculptures that she called bichos, that are called critters, like little animals. And they're sculptures, this is crucial, they're not really meant to be displayed as objects, they're meant to be used. Remember when in the beginning, Bishop says that Brazilian artists are much more tactile, haptic. Haptic means like involved with touch. These you would pick up and touch, and they're not static. Like they have hinges, and you can move them. So it's almost like, playing with a little critter or something like that, right? So already in these early works by Lygia Clark, she's engaging the public and inviting them to be participants and to engage with the object. Later in her career, by the end of the 60s and into the 70s, again, where she's forced to leave Brazil, and she's teaching and working with a collective group of students at the Sorbonne in Paris, she leaves objects behind altogether. And she's not even... So she's not interested in making objects anymore. She's interested in making situations, almost like the situationist. But she's much more informed by psychoanalysis, and the mind and the body connection, the way in which we're embodied, we're thinking beings that are corporeal, that we have bodies, and we sense the world and think through our bodies. And so she's much more interested in working with the body and the collective body, so both like us as individuals, as singularities, but also us as collectives, as like, we're social creatures, like we're with other people. And so she's interested in that, and she's definitely not interested in what was becoming very popular and well known at the time, which would be like body art or performance art, where the artist doesn't make work, but he or she uses their body as an object of art, right? She's not interested in objecthood at all. She doesn't want to make her body into an object to be consumed by spectators or whatever. She wants nothing to do really with art. She wants nothing to do with the divide between spectator and artist and body or work, right? She's interested in this immanent, immersive situation of people coming together and becoming attuned to their own bodies, to their psyche, and to each other, right? So she started devising what she called propositions, which would be moments of enacting people's engagement with each other. And probably the most famous is this baba anthropophagica, anthropophagic slobber. Anthropophagic means cannibalism. It has a rich tradition within Brazilian history and also modern Brazilian artists who started to play with this idea of cultural cannibalism. Which would be consuming other cultures and then making something different with them. So this anthropophagic slobber, it would be people getting together. One would lay down in almost like this meditative sort of way, and everybody else would start taking these colored strings and putting them in their mouth, and then taking them back out so they'd be dripping with saliva, and then they would lay the yarn or the thread on the person's body. And it's almost like ritualistic fashion, right? So over time, during this engagement with these people, this engagement together, like the body would slowly start to form into this wet, thready cocoon. And the idea was, I mean, in some ways I kind of read this as like a Buddhist practice or something like that, a type of meditation. The idea is to become attuned to your body and to your mind, and what it means to be with other people, right? Lygia Clark was really interested. This might sound totally gross to you, right? It is a pretty visceral work of participatory art. But I think above all, what Lygia Clark was interested in, and she understood very early on, that our bodies were being in some ways controlled and informed, that like our very relationship and rapport with our bodies are in some ways micromanaged through politics, but through media and through the things we consume, right? So this is a little bit like The Situationists and The Spectacle, but her answer to this was to go back to the body itself and be attentive to it, right? And have these propositions where people get together and they try to figure out what it is to have a body, right? Rather than just simply be told what a body is and how you should use it through advertising and through a consumer social space, right? So this is what Lygia Clark was all about. She's a fantastic, a really brilliant artist. And underneath this lecture, I'm going to MoMA has a really nice essay on her. So if you want to learn more about her, I would read that. The other really important Brazilian artist is Cildo Meireles, who did a number of works that are socially engaged. This is in 1970, a part of a really important exhibition in Brazil. It's called Tiradentes, Totem Monument to the Political Prisoner. Tiradentes is a colonial hero in Brazil. He helped overthrow. He was martyred. He was killed by the Portuguese, who were colonizing, the colonizers of Brazil. But he helped lead a revolution so that they would decolonize themselves. This would be in the 19th century, 18th and 19th centuries. So on the 100-year anniversary, Cildo Meireles did this installation, which was public. People would see it. He was outside. He had a stake. He had a stake, and he tied 10 live chickens, to the stake, and then lit the whole thing on fire. So the chickens basically burned alive. And so it was like a reenactment of this martyrdom of this important political figure in Brazil. So it was a very confrontational work. And then also so it's very political, but then also there are all sorts of interesting and kind of harrowing ethical questions as to whether or not a participatory work can use non-humans, and in what way can non-humans consent to being used in a work, and is it okay to burn chickens alive, right, for a work of art? All these things lead to really interesting questions that we can talk about. More directly participatory and socially engaged would be probably his most famous works, which are called insertions into ideological circuits. This is the version that's the Coca-Cola project, the most well known. And so what he did is he noticed that Coca-Cola bottles would be sold in Brazil, where he lived. People would buy them and drink the soda, and then send the bottle back to the factory. It would be refilled and then brought back out into circulation. And so what he did, he would get empty bottles, and rather than just put them back into circulation right away, he would alter them. He would put slogans, like the most famous one would be "Yankees go home." Yankees being, U.S. And here he's speaking directly about these multinational corporations that are coming in already in the 60s and 70s, and doing business. For various reasons outside of their home countries, mainly that have to do with political and economic incentives. And so these were like little minor protests that he wrote on the bottle. If the bottle is empty, you can't really read it very well. So when it would go back to the factory, the Coca-Cola, the workers there wouldn't notice. So they would just get refilled and sent back out to the public. And then people would start to notice this, right? They would buy Coca-Cola and they'd be like, oh, wait a second, this is not my normal Coca-Cola bottle. This has political commentary on it, right? So in that sense, the whole distribution chain of this soda drink, of Coca-Cola, became the work, as did all the people who would buy it. And then, it's a modest political engagement or activation, but, someone might become more politically aware through consuming Coca-Cola. So this is a form of participatory work, but probably the work that's the most participatory, and the one that is actually going to provide a nice pivot point for us towards our Argentinian examples, is this really incredible installation he did called Fiat Lux, the Sermon on the Mount, in the mid 70s. So what it was is you would walk in, and the floor would be sandpaper. So you would walk in and you'd feel like you're rubbing on something, right? In the middle of the space, there was a large stack of matchbooks. So the most well-known, like the highest-selling matchbooks in Brazil at the time, they were called Fiat Lux. This is what everybody would use to light their cigars or cigarettes or whatever. So you have this huge pile of matches. And so you can imagine, you have all these matches here, it feels very flammable, and you walk in, and it feels like your feet are, like you're walking on the part of the matchbook that would start a fire, right? So already there, it feels very tense, and already you as a viewer, as someone visiting this gallery, all of a sudden you become part of the work. It's unavoidable. Then he hired these guys to look like bodyguards to protect the matchbooks, as if the public is actually has a risk of lighting on fire, which I suppose it did, right? And while they were nominally bodyguards, they also looked like people from the secret police at the time in Brazil. So remember, this is a harrowing moment in Brazil and in Argentina and other places in Latin America, where you'd have these secret military police and the police itself and the military itself, where people could get picked up. They could be assumed to be revolutionary or counter the regime, and they would get disappeared. They would get killed, or they would end up in prison, and they would end up tortured, right? So imagine living in a situation like this. It's got to be just your daily life is filled with fear and suspicion, right? And so it's as if this installation is replicating that ambiance, this really horrifying, fearful ambiance of living under a military regime. And at one point, the audience actually started to try to go get to get the matches. Like they actually tried to, and the gallery completely freaked out. They had to close down the show. Cildo Meireles himself came to try to diffuse the situation, but the police showed up, and the whole thing was supposed to last for a certain amount of time, but it got cut short, right? So a very incendiary work. And one that clearly is involving the public, but less in a playful way, as we saw with Oiticica, less in a therapeutic way, as we saw with Lygia Clark, but here it's a more threatening participatory work, which gets us to our Argentinian examples, which is what Bishop concentrates most in this in the chapter for this week. And the most important figure for this is Oscar Masotta, who was a writer, a theorist. He also made some works of art that took their point of departure from what was becoming very popular in New York, which were happenings by which were devised by Alan Caprow. And happenings were happening in New York. Masotta visited New York and is influenced by them. A happening would be artists sort of setting up a situation for the public to do various things. So it's definitely part of the history of socially engaged and participatory works. And there was a complete in happenings, like Capra very famously says that art and life, they're both the same thing. And there was no separation between like the performer and the audience, right? Masotta sort of turned this on its head, or at least he was less thrilled or enamored with happenings. And so he started to make happenings that were either happenings that didn't actually happen, which is funny. So he's definitely interested in systems theory, and he's interested already in the 60s and 70s about how information goes through society, through the media and through political channels, how it exists as information. This is an important idea for artists during this period, and it's still an important idea for us today to understand how information moves around. And so he started to have happenings that really only happened on paper. So kind of a subtle little critique of happenings. But he did also actually do happenings. So here's examples of Capra, of his happenings. He did do happenings. If I remember correctly, he had 4 different ones. He did 4 works. And this one was called To Induce the Spirit of the Age from 1966. And this is an important one for us. This is one of the big examples from this chapter. And so what he did is, in a gallery, he hired a number of elderly people, both men and women, and he paid them to stand there to be looked at by an audience. So, like the audience would come into the gallery and see these people who are just standing there. They're paid to be standing there. But there would also be very abrasive sounds directed towards them, some painful sounds. So already there we have a certain level of hostility. Not only these people being paid just to stand there, but they're being paid to experience, this sort of hostile, abrasive noise. And they would also be shot at with fire extinguishers. And so I think you can tell, as a participatory work, as a work using the public, this is not a feel-good, let's have fun, let's eat some food together, and let's make art like a fun participatory project. This is somewhat hostile. And he even says, like, what were you doing with this work? There were a lot of people that were angry about this work, especially people on the left. They say, why are you exploiting these people? Like, this is not what the left is all about. This is not what leftist politics is all about. And Masotta certainly was on the left, and he was certainly against the military regime. Now we're in the Argentinian context. But there seems to be something about this more antagonistic, hostile approach that he thought was gonna be more fruitful, or would activate something a little bit more clearly, rather than more of a feel-good work of art. And he even says explicitly, he says, I want this to be a social situation where that's sadistic. So there's something sadistic about the work. The word sadistic comes from the Marquis de Sade, a pretty notorious writer during the French Revolution, who wrote all about desire and giving into your desires, some of which would be, very sexual and very violent all at once. And Masotta is informed by this, and he's informed by someone like Jacques Lacan, who's writing about Sade within a psychoanalytic context. And Lacan will say that it's very important to understand your desires, even the ones that are uncomfortable, even the ones that make you think, oh, I can't believe I have this desire, because it might be violent, or it might be hostile, or whatever it might be. So for Lacan, rather than repress that, rather than disavow it, Lacan thought that the best thing to do is to go all the way through and to understand your desires, even the ones that make you uncomfortable. So there's a way in which Masotta is thematizing this type of sadism in a way that maybe is constructive, right? But it certainly is. One of the things this work does is it shows how people can be. It sort of doubles down on the way in which people can be induced to do certain things simply by being paid, right? That economic exchange is the thing that allows people to be put into situations that are hostile, right? So there's a way in which he's replicating or doubling down on that logic through a work of art, right? And I'll be interested to hear what we all think about this strategy. right? Which seems counterintuitive, maybe cynical, maybe hypocritical. But on the other hand, it might actually be, in some antagonistic sort of way, it might actually also be critical. It might actually shock people into political activation, or a way of being activated to understand your own sort of sadistic drives that you might have, that you try not to think about and you don't want to have, right? So that's a nice way to talk about that work. There's also another artist. I think we should also know that Marta Minujín is making works at this time, also informed by happenings, and is influencing Masotta. So she's really interesting. And she did a work in 1973 at MoMA in New York, called Kidnappings, which is it's a portmanteau. That's a two words put together. So you have kidnapping, right, and then also happening. So kidnapping is put together. So she had a show at MoMA, and this was really playful, but it's also kind of dark. So there were a number of things that happened during your show at MoMA, but one of the things that happened is at some point you had people that were performers in her work, and you see them here. They're kind of dressed up in paint and so on and so on. At one point, they kidnap people from the audience, and most of the people in the audience were in the know, like they had agreed to this beforehand. But they get kidnapped and then taken to various places in New York, like office buildings or concerts or restaurants or whatever it is, a number of different places, right? So it's this participatory work where the audience has been kidnapped. It's a happening of kidnapping, and it was light, it was fun, right? It wasn't dark, but everyone understood that back in Argentina, people really are getting kidnapped. People really are getting disappeared and tortured and killed by the military regime there. And so it would have, even though it's playful, it would have this dark edge, this political resonance of what's happening in South America, right? And the other, so we talked about Oscar Masotta, who's really important, and one of the artists who worked with him, he had like reading groups. He was the connector in many ways for a lot of different artists. One of the artists that took part and was influenced by Masotta would be Oscar Boni, and here is his work that's really, really famous. La Familia Obrera, the Workers' Party from 1968, and was part of an exhibition, Experienza 68, which was a very, very important exhibition. It was at the Instituto di Tella in 1968. And this was it was, as you can imagine, a pretty controversial work. And this is one work that I hope we're going to talk about. This is probably the work we should talk about the most when we get together, because it's so rich and interesting, and it sets up a lot of the later stakes for participatory art in the 90s and in contemporary art. So what he did, a little like Oscar Masotta, but I think it's more clearly an engagement of class and equality, is he went and he got a worker, a working family, a man, his wife, and his young boy, and he paid the family twice the money that he made at his job, to sit on this plinth. They're like living sculptures in the gallery, to sit there for the whole day, and simply go about. You can read or whatever, but basically you're there to be displayed to the public. So they, in some ways, they've been turned into objects, into living sculptures for what's probably more of a middle class or elite clientele of the museum, of the art world, right? And so this is really rich, and this is really a complex work. Like, what does it mean for an artist to be able to pay a family twice of what they normally make during a day, so that they can be reified, so that they can be, reification means to be turned into something concrete or turned into an object, right? To then be ogled at by a class of public that's over and above them. This has become a really well-known and important work for for participatory practices, and it's clearly like Masotta. It's a work that's critical of class, and it's a critical of social injustice through economic inequality, right? But it's doing the very thing that it's against in some ways. So you can imagine it was quite controversial, and some people could even get upset about this work, that it's so it seems to have a type of exploitation at its center, right? This has gone on to be it's been photographed, and this is in MoMA's collection, so it's actually become a work of art. But we should be aware that the original work of art is much more this social relationship between two classes. This is a famous photograph of clearly like a more upper class family looking at this lower class family as these living sculptures on a plinth, right? So lots of interesting things to talk through of this work, and I hope we do when we get to our Zoom session. But I do we'll finish with this work by Roberta Blake at this same exhibition, which was the most controversial, believe it or not. So what he did is kind of amazing. He installed a bathroom, women's and men's. This is before unisex bathrooms. And you would go in, you would open the door, and it would be one room and there'd be nothing in it. So they were essentially fake bathrooms. And over the course of the exhibition, people, as you probably could guess, they started to graffiti. One, I guess maybe some people were disappointed, like they really did have to go to the bathroom. But others just took it as a chance to graffiti. And of course, they graffitied things that, like, political messages and messages that would be against the military regime. And this became very controversial, and the police showed up and they shut down the exhibition and they censored this work. So Roberta Blake's work was locked up. So it couldn't be, the work was essentially shut down. And in solidarity, other artists in the show then went to the exhibition. They took their works and threw them out the window, threw them out into the street, and destroyed their works as a way to push back on the censorship and on the repression of creative freedom. And so then this work, which was incidental, like this was not planned, this is yet another type of work where the public becomes involved, because there's this moment of censorship, there's this moment of repression of creativity, which leads to this unforeseen destruction of artworks out in the street, which then all these people start milling about, and it becomes its own work in some ways, right? An unplanned one. So that's my last example. Again, if you're interested in some of these works, I'm going to give a little extra reading, because there's so much to say. These works are so rich, and I hope we have a really nice conversation, especially about the Oscar Boni's the workers family. Well, that's a typo. That should be the workers family. Sorry about that. Okay, everybody, I hope you enjoyed the Brazilian and Argentinian context of participatory art, and I look forward to talking about this when we get together over Zoom. Take care, everybody.